We really appreciate the opportunity to pay tribute at this meeting to the Ethiopian Revolution and to the person who emerged during that revolution as the leader because of his tremendous will and his decisive action when the revolution was at its most critical stages, and that is Mengistu Haile Mariam. From the point of view of its class content, the Ethiopian Revolution was in many ways an attempt to carry through the deepest social transformation to date on the African continent. It was fueled by intense internal class contradictions, heightened by the previous regime's reliance on imperialism and the penetration of imperialism into Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the one country in Africa that was never colonized successfully by the powers of Europe, although Italy invaded it in the 1890s and again in the 1930s. Nevertheless, even without military conquest, the pressures of neo-colonialism through the role of international finance capital greatly sharpened the class antagonisms within Ethiopia throughout the 20th century. Now, Mengistu and the Ethiopian Revolution are rarely mentioned in the capitalist media, and certainly never favorably. But even today, more than 2 decades since Mengistu was forced to leave his country, and a government favored by Western imperialism was established at a conference held in London, Mengistu is still extremely popular among Ethiopia's impoverished masses. I searched the web for recent postings about him. Ever since he was forced out of his country, Mengistu has resided in Zimbabwe, which itself has been carrying out its own struggle against imperialism for years, and which welcomed him as a revolutionary comrade. He has given interviews recently, and at least one volume of his memoirs was published 2 years ago, but not in English, unfortunately. I believe in Amharic, the main language spoken in Ethiopia, but not the only language. All copies of it were immediately sold out in Addis Ababa. However, I did find several websites with information about Ethiopia that contained comments from readers. Some held him in the highest praise, calling him the greatest leader ever. Others called him the vilest names. And this is to be expected, because Mengistu was both a political leader and a man of action who intervened decisively in favor of the oppressed masses at critical points in the development of the Ethiopian Revolution. He earned the undying hatred of the landowning aristocracy, the bankers, the rich merchants, and all who looked to Western imperialism to help uphold their exploitation of the Ethiopian workers and peasants. Now, Mengistu was born into a poor family in Oromo province, which is an extremely oppressed part of Ethiopia, where the masses of people were literally enslaved to work for a class of landowning aristocrats, most of whom were not from Oromo at all. They were absentee landlords. He joined the army as a private, probably because it was one of the few career opportunities open to him, as many young, poor youth do. But he worked his way up the ranks. Eventually, he became a colonel. The peasants in Ethiopia, before the revolution, had to turn over a very large portion of their crops, in some cases up to 75%, to the landlords, and this kept them always on the edge of bare subsistence. But in the early 1970s, a drought in large areas of the countryside pushed them over that edge, and hundreds of thousands of rural people died of famine. Now, the ruling class, which was semi-feudal, semi-bourgeois property owners, people who had come through their wealth hereditarily through ownership of land over many generations, but had then begun to invest their wealth in bourgeois property, commerce, banks, so on. This class, which was headed, whose state was headed by Emperor Haile Selassie, they lived in relative opulence in Addis and a few other cities, and left the management of their lands to their agents. Many of them sent their children to schools in Europe and the US, and developed an appetite for a Western lifestyle, which intensified their demands upon the peasantry. Their government and this class kept knowledge of the famine from being reported in the cities or in the news media. But as refugees from the drought-stricken areas began reaching Addis and other cities in 1974, the general mood in the cities as well as in the countryside became one of rebellion. Tremendous struggles broke out across Ethiopia, in which the peasants seized the land, and they either killed or expelled the landlords and their agents. At the same time, strikes and demonstrations began rocking the cities. Now, Ethiopia had a very small working class, concentrated in just a few cities. And they lived, like the peasants, they lived a very precarious existence. However, the impact of the revolutions in Russia and China had been felt in Ethiopia and inspired the growth of several different Marxist parties, whose members came mostly from the students and the civil service workers. At the time of the Ethiopian Revolution, while all these things were happening spontaneously from the masses of people, these parties were sharply divided. There was a division in the world communist movement at the time between the Soviet Union and China, and some gravitated in one or the direction and others in the other direction. Their role in giving leadership to this revolution, which was occurring across this very huge country, was very limited. There wasn't much they could do. They were mainly small groups concentrated in just a few cities. But this massive uprising, which it convulsed Ethiopian society, and the masses desperately needed some instrument that could direct the struggle against the exploiting classes on a nationwide basis. It was unusual, unpredictable, but the revolution found that instrument. It found it in the army itself, a very unlikely place for revolutionary leadership, but one that is not unprecedented, because soldiers have joined revolutions in Russia, they joined the revolutions in China. So what happened in Ethiopia in 1974? In February, after all these strikes and demonstrations, the cabinet that represented the feudal oligarchy was toppled by popular pressure. Several months later, in June of '74, about 125 members of the armed forces were elected by their units to participate in a coordinating committee to take leadership of this revolution. And among them was Mengistu. As Mengistu was to put it later, the revolution erupted from within the vascular system of the enraged masses. It gives you a feeling for what was happening and how the sentiment and the energy, the revolutionary energy of the masses of people was finding its way even into the military. By August, this coordinating committee, which is known in the Amharic language as the Derg, that's the name for committee, had abolished the Crown Council, which was the leading government body representing the old bourgeoisie and feudal owners, and they soon announced a program for a democratic revolution. The Derg also began expropriating properties that had made members of the council very rich. The Derg then ordered television to show a documentary about the famine, a documentary that had been made by a British journalist but had never been shown in Ethiopia. The horrible suffering and massive deaths shocked the people of Addis, who were not as close to the ground to know what had been going on in the rural areas. The very next day, Emperor Haile Selassie was deposed. In November, a couple of months later, a struggle came to a head within the Derg itself, because the first group that were elected to the leadership of this committee contained many high-ranking officers who had been the organizers of the state and its armed forces for the old ruling classes. Their sympathies lay with the ruling classes to one degree or another, even though they were, some of them were moving over towards the position of being for some sort of a democratic republic. But in November, some 60 high-ranking officers and officials of the government who resisted this democratic stage of the revolution were given revolutionary justice. They were executed. The Derg began nationalizing the banks, the insurance companies, and other pillars of the bourgeoisie. Now, meanwhile, in the land, the peasants themselves were taking care of the landlords. It really didn't require the military to go to each village. The peasants were doing it. But the Derg took the position that the peasants had the right to the land and could be armed to defend themselves against the landlords. By February of 1975, there were mass mobilizations in Addis of hundreds of thousands of workers and peasants who supported this struggle against the old regime. And it was particularly in response to a campaign of terror that had begun by the reactionary classes against anybody they perceived as the leaders of the revolution that this demonstration took place. A month after that demonstration, in March '75, the Derg declared that all rural land in Ethiopia had become the collective property of the people, that the system of feudal land tenure was abolished, and that the peasants had the government's support in setting up peasants' associations to develop agriculture, and they were getting arms too. In that month, 800,000 people came to Addis for a rally in support of these measures. This was an incredibly popular revolution, but it was still only in the first stage.